I watched my stepsister Emma sign the inheritance documents with trembling fingers, her face flushed with victory. Behind her, my stepmother Margaret wore that shark-like smile I'd seen 1,000 times, in this life and the last. They didn't know I was recording everything. They didn't know that 3 blocks away, my real parents, the Castellanos, worth $47 billion, were finalizing the paperwork that would make me their legal heir. But most of all, they didn't know I'd already lived through this exact moment once before, and I'd died screaming in a hospital bed with no one who cared. Sign here, Arya. My father, I still couldn't help thinking of him that way, though he'd proven he was nothing of the sort, pushed the papers across his mahogany desk. You're agreeing that Emma will inherit the estate, the company shares, and the trust. In exchange, you'll receive a severance of $50,000 and relinquish all claims to the Morrison family assets. $50,000. For 23 years of being their verbal punching bag, their unpaid servant, their scapegoat. For the years I'd spent raising Emma while Margaret got drunk on wine and my father buried himself in work. For every birthday they forgot, every achievement they dismissed, every tear I cried into my pillow. In my previous life, I'd fought this moment. I'd screamed and begged and pleaded. I'd told them about the business strategy I'd developed, the contacts I'd cultivated, the deals I'd closed while working as my father's assistant for poverty wages. They'd laughed in my face. Emma had taken credit for all of it, married the CEO I'd been dating, and inherited everything when father died 2 years later. I'd been left with nothing, working 3 jobs just to afford the cancer treatments they refused to help pay for. I died alone at 29, my last thought a bitter prayer for a second chance. When I woke up on my 18th birthday, 5 years in the past, I'd thought I was dreaming. But the date on my phone, the younger face in the mirror, the familiar ache of old bruises from where Margaret had accidentally shoved me into a doorframe, it was all real. I'd been reborn. And this time, I knew exactly how to play the game. Of course, Father, I said sweetly, picking up the pen. Emma's eyes widened slightly. She'd expected a fight. I'm so happy for Emma. She deserves everything. The irony in my voice was lost on them entirely. I signed with a flourish, each stroke of the pen a small act of rebellion they were too blind to see. Let me take you back to the beginning, to help you understand why this moment tastes so sweet. My mother, my biological mother, Catherine Morrison, died when I was 3. I have only fragments of memories, her laugh, the way she smelled like lavender, her gentle hands braiding my hair. My father remarried within a year, bringing Margaret and 6-year-old Emma into our lives like a hurricane disguised as a fresh start. The abuse started. Small. Arya, let Emma have that toy. She's younger. She wasn't. Arya, you don't need new clothes. Emma's recital costume is more important. Arya, stop being so selfish. Can't you see your sister needs attention? It escalated. By the time I was 10, I was doing all the household chores while Emma took piano lessons and dance classes. I cooked dinner, cleaned the house, did the laundry, all while maintaining straight A's because any grade below perfect earned me silent treatment and a locked bedroom door with no dinner. My father watched it all happen and did nothing. Worse, he enabled it. Margaret knows best about raising girls, he'd say, disappearing into his study with a whiskey. Don't cause trouble, Arya. Be grateful for what you have. What I had was a family that treated me like an unpaid servant. What Emma had was everything I'd ever wanted: love, attention, support, and the unwavering belief that she could do no wrong. In my first life, I'd internalized it all. I'd believed I was the problem, that if I just tried harder, was better, more perfect, they'd finally love me. I'd worked myself to the bone for scraps of approval that never came. But here's what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known. My mother's family, the Castellanos, had been searching for me for 20 years. My mother, Catherine, was the only daughter of Roberto and Isabella Castellano, founders of Castellano Industries, a multinational conglomerate spanning tech, real estate, pharmaceuticals, and green energy. When she married my father against their wishes, he was a small-time real estate developer they deemed beneath her, they'd cut her off, too proud to reconcile. After she died, they'd tried to contact me. They'd sent letters, tried to visit, attempted to establish custody. My father, bitter and greedy, had blocked every attempt. He'd moved us 3 times, changed our phone numbers, threatened restraining orders. The Castellanos were powerful, but my father had legal custody, and without evidence of abuse, court sided with the surviving parent. They never stopped looking for me. In my first life, they found me 2 weeks after I died. Margaret had gleefully posted about finally being free of that burden on Facebook, tagging my obituary. The Castellanos saw it, investigated, and uncovered 26 years of abuse, theft, and fraud. They destroyed the Morrison family in court, but it was hollow victory. I was already gone. This time, I found them first. 3 months after my rebirth, on my 18th birthday, I walked into the Castellano Industries headquarters and asked to speak with Roberto Castellano. Security nearly threw me out until I showed them my mother's locket, the one thing of hers I'd hidden from Margaret's grasping hands, and mentioned her maiden name. I was in Roberto's office within 15 minutes. The DNA test took 3 days. The tears, the apologies, the rage at what had been done to me, that took much longer. My grandmother Isabella held me for hours while I told them everything, every detail of every cruelty. Roberto's face had gone from grief to fury to cold, calculating determination. "We'll destroy them," he'd said. "We'll take everything." "No," I'd replied, "Auspicially, not yet. I need to do this right. I need them to hand me my freedom willingly, and then I need to watch them realize what they've lost." Because I knew something they didn't. Morrison & Associates, my father's real estate company, was on the verge of collapse. In my previous life, I'd saved it with a revolutionary development proposal that Emma had stolen and presented as her own. The company had thrived, making the Morrisons millions. This time, I fed Emma completely different information. I accidentally left my laptop open with fake documents detailing a disastrous investment strategy. I made phone calls where she could overhear, discussing properties that were actually toxic assets. I planted seeds of terrible business decisions and watched her eagerly collect them like treasure. Meanwhile, I worked as my father's assistant, just like before. But every legitimate deal I brokered, every genuine opportunity I discovered, I quietly brought to the Castellanos instead. Through shell companies and anonymous intermediaries, we bought up properties around Morrison & Associates holdings. We secured contracts they were bidding on. We systematically dismantled their future piece by piece. And all the while, I played the perfect victim. Submissive, desperate for approval, trying so hard to earn love that would never come. The inheritance meeting was scheduled for my 23rd birthday. Today, in this new timeline. In my previous life, this was when everything had been ripped away. This time, I'd orchestrated the entire thing. 3 months ago, I'd accidentally let slip to Emma that father was considering making me his primary heir because of my contributions to the company. It was a complete lie, but Emma's paranoia did the rest. She'd launched a systematic campaign to turn father against me, feeding him lies about my disloyalty and secret plans to push her out. Margaret had helped, of course. Together, they'd convinced father that I was a threat, that I needed to be eliminated from the family business entirely. They'd pushed for this meeting, for these documents, for my official disinheritance. I'd let them think it was their idea. "It's done," father said, collecting the signed papers. "You'll receive the $50,000 within 30 days, and Arya, I think it's best if you find your own place. Emma will need your room for her new office." Emma practically glowed with triumph. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, sis, but you understand? Some people are just meant to lead and others are meant to follow." I smiled at her, and something in that smile made her falter. "You're absolutely right, Emma. Some people are born leaders. I'm so glad you finally found your purpose." "What's that supposed to mean?" Margaret snapped. "Nothing at all, Mother." I'd never called her that before, always Margaret or Mrs. Morrison. The word tasted like poison, but I needed them comfortable, complacent. "I'm just happy for Emma. She's worked so hard." On stealing my work, I didn't add. I stood smoothing my simple dress. I'd deliberately worn something cheap and shabby, playing the part one last time. "I'll be out by the end of the week. Thank you for everything." The sarcasm was there, but they were too drunk on victory to taste it. I left the office and walked straight to my car, not the beaten-up Honda Civic they thought I drove. But the sleek Tesla I kept parked 3 blocks away, registered under my legal name, Aria Castellano Morrison. I'd officially been adopted by my grandparents 6 months ago. The Morrisons didn't know because they'd never bothered to check public records, too certain of my powerlessness to imagine I'd have any secrets. My phone buzzed with a text from Roberto. It's done. We own 73% of Morrison & Associates as of this morning. The audit team found everything you said they would. Are you ready? I typed back, give me 2 weeks. I want them to feel secure first. Let them celebrate. Because that was the thing about revenge. It wasn't enough to win. They needed to understand what they'd lost. They needed to feel the same powerlessness, the same crushing despair they'd inflicted on me for 20 years. I drove to the Castellano estate in the Hamptons, where Isabella was waiting with champagne and my favorite meal, real carbonara, made with her own hands despite having a full kitchen staff. This was love. Someone remembering what you liked, caring about your comfort, celebrating your victories. How do you feel? She asked, studying my face with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. Free, Annie, I said, and then I cried, great heaving sobs of relief and grief and rage. She held me through all of it, this grandmother I'd been denied my whole life, and I let myself feel everything I'd buried for so long. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in watching karma unfold. Emma immediately started implementing the business strategy I'd fed her. She convinced father to invest heavily in a commercial development in Newark that I knew, from both timelines, was built on contaminated land. The environmental lawsuits alone would cost millions. She pushed them to sell off their most valuable properties at what she thought was peak market value, not knowing I'd had the Castellanos manipulate local markets to create artificial inflation that would crash within months. She fired key employees I'd told her were disloyal, not knowing they were the only thing holding the company's legitimate operations together. She alienated long-term clients with her arrogance and inexperience. She made every single mistake I'd carefully laid out for her like breadcrumbs to a gingerbread house. And father let her too, blinded by favoritism to see the disaster unfolding. Meanwhile, Margaret spent money like it was infinite. A new Mercedes, a renovation on the house, a summer home in the Bahamas. She threw a party celebrating Emma's promotion to CEO in training, inviting everyone from their social circle. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd spent $200,000 on it. Money the Morrisons didn't actually have anymore, though they didn't know it yet. I spent those 2 weeks being officially integrated into Castellano Industries. Press releases announced that Roberto and Isabella's long-lost granddaughter had been found and would be joining the company's executive board. My face was on the cover of Forbes, Business Insider, and the Wall Street Journal. Not as Aria Morrison, the abused stepdaughter, as Aria Castellano, billionaire heiress and rising business prodigy. The articles detailed my education, a Harvard MBA I'd earned online while being the Morrisons' servant, paid for by working 4 jobs they never knew about. They highlighted the business proposals I'd developed, now credited to me rather than stolen by Emma. They mentioned my estranged relationship with her father's family in vague terms that legal had carefully vetted. And not one person in the Morrison household saw the news. They didn't read Forbes. They didn't follow business news. They existed in their own small bubble of petty tyranny and social climbing, never imagining their world was anything but eternal. On day 13, the lawsuits started arriving. The environmental lawsuit for the Newark property, breach of contract suits from the clients Emma had alienated, a wrongful termination suit from the employees she'd fired who had ironclad contracts I'd helped write in my first life, an IRS audit, tipped off by anonymous information about financial irregularities. Father called me for the first time since I'd left. Aria, I need you to come in. There's been some complications with the business. I'm sorry, Father, but I don't work for Morrison & Associates anymore. You made that very clear. Don't be difficult. This is family business. I'm not family, remember? You disinherited me. You told me to find my own place. I have. I hung up before he could respond. He called back 6 times. I declined every call. Margaret tried next, her voice syrupy sweet. Aria, darling, I think we may have been too harsh. Perhaps we could discuss— No, thank you, Mrs. Morrison. I'm very busy with my new position. New position? What are you talking about? What kind of job could you possibly have gotten in 2 weeks? I'm on the executive board of Castellano Industries. Perhaps you've heard of it? The silence was beautiful. Then, that's impossible. You're lying. You're delusional. I hung up and blocked her number. Emma was the last to try showing up at my apartment, the tiny studio I'd maintained as part of my cover. She pounded on the door, screaming, "Open up! Aria, I know you're behind this. You sabotaged us. You gave me false information." I opened the door. "Hello, Emma. What false information? I never gave you any business advice. I was just your father's assistant. You're the CEO in training, remember? Surely you're not suggesting you stole confidential information from your father's assistant and presented it as your own work? Because that would be corporate espionage, and I'd hate to have to report that to the authorities." Her face went white. You bitch. You did this on purpose." "I have no idea what you're talking about. I signed away my inheritance, just like you wanted. I left the family business, just like father demanded. I've moved on with my life. If Morrison and Associates is struggling, perhaps you should examine your own business decisions instead of blaming others. You think you're so smart. You think you've won. But we'll destroy you. With what money, Emma? With what power? You're drowning in lawsuits you can't afford. Your company is leveraged to the breaking point on properties that are worthless. You fired everyone competent enough to help you, and you burned every bridge I spent years building because you thought my work was easy enough for you to replicate." I smiled. "You wanted to be the heir so badly. Congratulations. You inherited a sinking ship." I closed the door in her face and listened to her scream obscenities through the wood. Then I called building security and had her removed from the premises. Day 15 was when everything truly collapsed. Morrison and Associates filed for bankruptcy. The IRS froze their assets pending the audit. The environmental lawsuit resulted in criminal charges against father for knowingly developing contaminated land, emails that Emma had sent under his account, but which he couldn't prove he hadn't written, became evidence of deliberate fraud. Their house went into foreclosure. Margaret's Mercedes was repossessed. The Bahamas property, bought with laundered money from the business, was seized. And then the media picked up the story. Not the business collapse, that was just local news. The real story was what the Castellanos' investigative team had uncovered and leaked to the press: 20 years of financial abuse, documentation of every time they'd stolen money from my mother's trust fund, the one she'd left specifically for me, which father had systematically drained, while claiming it had been used for family expenses, evidence that Margaret had forged my signature to access my college fund and spent it on Emma's extracurrences, proof that they'd claimed me as a dependent for tax benefits while forcing me to pay rent to live in what was legally half my house, medical records showing injuries consistent with abuse, paired with my childhood photos, bruises Margaret had explained away as clumsiness, testimony from neighbors, teachers, and family friends who'd witnessed the mistreatment but had been too afraid or too complicit to intervene. And the centerpiece, a video diary I'd kept in my first life, detailing years of abuse, which I'd hidden in a safety deposit box before I died. The Castellanos had found it when they'd investigated my death the first time. In this timeline, I'd retrieved it and provided it to their legal team. The court of public opinion was swift and brutal. The Morrisons went from respected community members to pariahs overnight. Former friends deleted them on social media. Emma's engagement to the CEO, yes, she'd still managed to sink her claws into him, was broken off within days. Margaret's social club revoked her membership. They tried to reach me, of course. Hundreds of calls, emails, texts, all blocked. Father tried to show up at Castellano Industries headquarters and was removed by security. Emma attempted to doorstep me at a charity gala and was escorted out by police. 3 weeks after I'd signed the inheritance documents, I received a letter from their attorney. They wanted to settle, to make things right. They were offering me a formal apology and $500,000 from their remaining assets. I had my lawyers respond with a counteroffer: full restitution of all stolen funds, calculated at $2.3 million with interest, a written confession of all abuse to be entered into public record, and a permanent restraining order preventing any contact with me or my family. They refused. They still thought they had leverage, that I needed them somehow. So we went to court. The trial was a media sensation. Every detail of my childhood was laid bare. The locked bedrooms, the withheld food, the verbal degradation, the forced labor, the stolen money, the systematic destruction of my self-worth. Character witnesses testified on my behalf. Teachers who'd noticed my bruises, neighbors who'd heard Margaret screaming at me, Emma's former friends who admitted she'd bragged about keeping Arya in her place. The Morrisons' defense was pathetic. Father claimed he'd been working too much to notice. Margaret insisted she'd been trying to teach me discipline and responsibility. Emma actually tried to argue that I'd been overly sensitive and misinterpreted normal sibling rivalry. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found in my favor on every count. The judgment was devastating. $4.7 million in restitution, plus punitive damages. Father was convicted of fraud and embezzlement, sentenced to 8 years in prison. Margaret was found civilly liable for abuse, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. Emma, as an accomplice to the corporate espionage and fraud, faced her own criminal charges. But the money, the convictions, none of that was the real victory. The real victory was what came after. With Morrison and Associates in bankruptcy, its assets were liquidated. The Castellanos bought everything at auction for pennies on the dollar. The company, the properties, even the family home. We dissolved Morrison and Associates entirely and integrated its few valuable assets into Castellano Industries. The house, my childhood home, the place where I'd been tormented for 20 years, we turned into a foundation for abused children. Every room that had witnessed my suffering was transformed into a safe haven for kids escaping situations like mine. Margaret's master suite became a counseling center. Emma's bedroom, with its princess canopy and walls of trophies for achievements she'd stolen from me, became a study room. My old tiny bedroom, the one with the lock on the outside of the door, was preserved exactly as it had been, turned into an educational exhibit about recognizing signs of abuse. We named it the Catherine Morrison Foundation for Children's Advocacy after my mother. Her portrait hung in the entry hall, smiling and beautiful, reclaiming the space that had erased her memory. Father was released after serving 5 years. He emerged to find himself penniless, unemployable, and utterly alone. Mother had divorced him from prison, taking half of nothing. He tried to contact me one last time, a rambling letter about regret and second chances. I never responded. Some bridges, once burned, should stay ashes. Emma struggled for years, her name too toxic for legitimate employment. I heard through industry gossip that she was working as a receptionist in Newark, living in a studio apartment, drowning in debt from her legal fees. Once, I saw her at a distance at a business conference. She'd crashed it, probably hoping to network. Our eyes met across the room. She started toward me, and I simply turned away. She wasn't worth my time anymore. Margaret ended up in a state-funded nursing home, her money gone, her social circle vanished. She wrote to me sometimes, angry, bitter letters blaming me for her downfall, insisting she'd been a good mother, that I was ungrateful and cruel. I never opened them. My assistant flagged them in my inbox, and I deleted them unread. Her opinion of me had stopped mattering the moment I signed those inheritance papers and walked away. As for me, I threw myself into Castellano Industries with the same intensity I'd once poured into earning the Morrisons' approval. But this time the work was rewarded, celebrated, built upon. I spearheaded the company's expansion into sustainable technology, turning my ideas, the ones Emma had tried to steal, into billion-dollar initiatives. I fell in love eventually. With someone kind, someone who'd also survived family trauma and understood the long shadow it cast. We married in a small ceremony at the Hamptons estate, surrounded by people who genuinely loved me. Roberto walked me down the aisle, tears in his eyes, whispering, "Your mother would be so proud." I had children, 2 beautiful daughters and a son. I raised them with the love I'd been denied, and every time I tucked them in or celebrated their achievements or simply held them when they were dead, I erased a little more of the Morrisons, poison from my soul. Isabella lived to meet her great-grandchildren. She died peacefully at 93, holding my hand, her last words, a benediction. "You saved yourself, darling. Never forget that. You saved yourself and you saved us all." Roberto followed her 2 years later. They left me everything, not just money, but legacy, purpose, love. I became CEO of Castellano Industries at 35, the youngest person to ever hold the position. Under my leadership, we tripled our valuation. We pioneered new technologies that changed industries. We became known not just for profit, but for ethical business practices, for employee welfare, for environmental stewardship. Everything the Morrisons company had never been, we became. I gave interviews sometimes when asked about my background. I was honest about the abuse, about the rebirth I'd been granted, about the revenge that had set me free. Some people criticized me, said I'd been too harsh, that family should forgive family. I disagreed then, and I disagree now. Forgiveness is not owed to people who are not sorry. Justice is not cruelty when it's proportional to the harm done, and sometimes the only way to heal is to cut out the rot completely and let new, healthy tissue grow in its place. The Morrisons had 23 years to love me. They chose abuse instead. I had one chance to rewrite my story, and I chose freedom. On the 20th anniversary of signing those inheritance documents, I stood in the great room of the Catherine Morrison Foundation, surrounded by hundreds of children we'd helped, dozens of families we'd saved, countless lives we'd changed. My daughters stood beside me, now young women themselves, brilliant and confident and kind. My son, studying architecture, had designed the foundation's new expansion wing. A journalist asked me if I'd ever regretted the path I'd taken, if I'd ever wished I'd tried to reconcile with my father's family. I looked at my children, my legacy, my hard-won peace. I thought of Emma signing those inheritance papers, so certain she'd won. I thought of Margaret's triumphant smile, of Father's dismissive signature, of the $50,000 they'd thought was generous. Not once, I said. They gave me exactly what I needed, my freedom. Everything I built after that, I built myself. That's the inheritance that actually mattered. The foundation's new wing opened that day. We'd expanded to serve 5,000 children annually, providing shelter, counseling, legal advocacy, and educational support. We'd helped reform child protection laws in 7 states. We'd partnered with law enforcement to identify and prosecute abusers. We'd created a network of safe houses and support systems that saved lives. This was my revenge, my legacy, my triumph. I took the pain they'd inflicted and transformed it into power, not just for myself, but for every child who'd suffered like I had. In my first life, I died alone and unmourned, my potential wasted, my voice silenced. In this life, I became the hero I'd needed when I was young. I became the mother my own mother never got to be. I became living proof that victims can become victors, that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that sometimes the best revenge is not just living well, it's building something so magnificent that it renders your abuser's entire existence irrelevant. The Morrisons took from me for 23 years. I took one afternoon to sign papers and walk away, and in doing so, I took everything that ever mattered: my dignity, my future, my family, and my peace. They chose Emma for the inheritance. I let them, because I already had something infinitely more valuable. I had myself, finally free, finally loved, finally home. 20 years later, Morrison & Associates was a footnote in business history, a cautionary tale about corporate fraud and family dysfunction. The Morrisons themselves were forgotten by everyone but the people they'd harmed. But the Castellanos? We were thriving, growing, building a legacy that would outlast us all. And me? I was happy. Genuinely, deeply, unshakably happy. That was my revenge. That was my victory. That was my inheritance, earned not by blood or law, but by surviving, choosing myself, and refusing to let their cruelty define my worth. I won not when I took everything from them, but when I realized they'd never had anything I actually wanted. They didn't know I'd already been adopted by billionaires, but more than that, they didn't know I'd already adopted a better version of myself, stronger, wiser, free from their poison. In the end, that was the sweetest triumph of all. They lost me, and I never needed them at all.